In a world equally as medieval as it is modern, there exists the Kingdom of Lebeau. In this small yet significant land, our protagonists, Estelle and Joshua, are only beginning their adventure which would mark history. This is the legend of heroes, Trails in the Sky. The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky is a turn-based Japanese role-playing game from the developers Nihon Falcom, who are one of the pioneers of the role-playing genre, with previous long-running successful series such as Ys or Dragon Slayers, the latter of which evolved into the Legend of Heroes, in which Trails is now a sub-series of. Before we get into this video properly, it's important to look at the chronology of the Trails series. The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky is a sub-series of the Trails series. It is a name for the first 3 games: Trails in the Sky first chapter, Trails in the Sky second chapter, and the final one, Trails in the Sky the third. Trails games are split up depending on what location or arc they follow for the most part. Trails in the Sky follows the Lebeau arc, the soon to be translated Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure follow the Crossbow arc, and Trails of Cold Steel follows the Erebonian arc. The current installment and most recent for Western audiences is Cold Steel 4. Right now, the West only has the 3 Trails in the Sky games and the 4 Trails of Cold Steel games. Later this year we are going to get Trails from Zero translated, and next year we're going to get Trails to Azure, which is the sequel to Zero, plus Trails to Reverie, which is the sequel to Cold Steel 4. It's important to distinguish between the different series in the Trails series. This is because whilst they are set in different countries, they all contribute to an overarching plot, and that's where I believe one of the big strengths in this series lies. The first 3 games, so the Lebeau arc or the Trails in the Sky games, will be the focus for this video. Trails games are a masterpiece when it comes to world building and character development. All of the games always culminate into one strong payoff. The length of the games, as Japanese games are, means such development can easily be achieved. The theme of continuity is always present within Falcom games, and the game is a perfect example of it gets better the more you play it. The further you dive into the complicated simulation of a world that Nihon Falcom has been creating since 2004. As many Japanese games are, the Nihon Falcom sound team, who does their music, are heavily praised and respected for their ability to consistently produce thematically relevant and brilliant songs, masterfully engineered to fit the current situation, arc or emotion. Now that I've achieved a general outline of the game and the series, it's time to get into the story introduction about our 2 young bracer protagonists who enter a world and who are about to witness the machinations of dark forces. As mentioned earlier, our story commences in the Kingdom of Lebeau. It is a relatively small nation situated to the south of the Grand Erebonian Empire and the west of the Calvard Republic. Lebeau is headed by its queen, Queen Alicia von Oslies II. Alongside the queen there exists the Royal Council, which is comprised of various mayors around the country, as well as a military and a scholarly figure. In the eastern city of Roland starts out our story. The game opens up with a flashback sequence showing a young boy being taken in by a man, introducing us to the game's major protagonist and her family. Estelle Bright is presented to be a sassy tomboy, quickly putting the new arrival in his place as he attempts to go against her. This new arrival is our other protagonist, Joshua, who is a reserved yet talented fighter, and whose calmness is juxtaposed with Estelle's energy. It's soon revealed that Joshua was taken in by Estelle's father, Cassius Bright. Estelle's character is strongly hinted at during this initially comedic encounter, serves as a foundation for her character, and it only makes her development even more obvious later on in the games. After this small prologue scene, it is fast forwarded to the present, with now adoptive sibling Joshua playing a keystone part of the Trails in the Sky OST from his harmonica, Whereabouts of Light. This song is fantastic as I think it perfectly sums up the Estelle-Joshua relationship, but also at the same time gets perfectly remixed to fit the tempo of the situation. Nihon Falcom's sound team are extremely talented at using a single song, but with many different instruments, tempos and sometimes lyrics, in so many different situations. These songs and continuity with them add a different level of personality, and you really associate them with Estelle and Joshua after playing the game. After some dialogue at the Estelle family home, it is revealed to the 2 protagonists that they have an exam to become a junior bracer. A bracer is effectively a member of the organisation, the bracer organisation, and they basically defend the civilians and serve them in times of peace. In times of war, their entire objective is to keep the civilians safe. Their independence from the government of each country means that they have their own authority, and sometimes, depending where they are, they don't have the authority recognised by the country's government. In this case, the country of Lebeau recognises them, and thus they are allowed into the country. For Estelle, the organisation is a major point of her development and character identity, and it's used often throughout the series to develop her character. The way Trails in the Sky first chapter presents its plot to you is simple enough. Joshua and Estelle have the story loop of going to each major city in Le Beau, doing quests and side quests there in the name of the Bracer organisation. During this you do some kind of main plot in the background, alongside general activities. Worry not, as they do culminate into one large coherent plot and things do bubble in the background, so you will get to see some interesting things at work. Additionally, you get to experience the world like Estelle and Joshua do, which I found really interesting, and getting a different perspective on different parts of the world and the country. The way towns are unique in each area is very interesting from a world building point of view. For example, you get to visit a commercial hub, a trading city, or a technological hub. Falcom's meticulous approach to world building is first reflected in the theme of each city, and it's really interesting to see how you get to see exactly how a city has sustained itself when you first arrive. Many of the plots in each city may seem local and unrelated at first, but they do start to culminate into one bigger plot and they start building towards one unknown thing. Falcom continues chucking unexpected twists and interesting moments to keep the player guessing. Though with enough thought and investigative work into the story, you might be able to figure out some of the twists that occur. It's important to know that the first chapter of Trails in the Sky is often criticised for the slow pacing due to this style of storytelling. By sending Estelle and Joshua around the country to deal with local adventurer level threats, it tends to burn out the average player quickly if you don't see enough returns for the main plot. If the player isn't committed to other parts of the game, then it becomes quite difficult to progress through. However, the first chapter serves as a massive, brilliant payoff for what is to come in the future. Whilst it may be weak initially, the setup is unrivaled and is why the second chapter is hailed as one of my favourite and one of the favourites of the community out there. It's not inaccurate to call Trails in the Sky FC a 60-hour prologue, because that's effectively what it is. It really focuses on the world building and having the player share Estelle and Joshua's experience as they explore and observe the different facets and undersides of the kingdom. The second chapter for Trails in the Sky is a much more traditional kind of RPG approach in terms of the story, so you have one big overall story, not these chunks which kind of connect together. And now that the world, characters and plots are well established to the player after the first game, a more connected plot occurs, which has a lot stronger stakes and a lot more of a personal link to it, because you've taken that time in the first game to go around and look at each area of Le Beau, meet the characters there, and when that comes back you start to feel a lot more of a personal connection to what's occurring. And that's why, obviously, playing in sequence first, then immediately into the second chapter is really good, because keeping that sense of familiarity really helps with the impact of the story. As for the third game, you may realise it doesn't share the same chapter naming convention, and it's just called the third. It's not directly tied to the main plot of the first and second game, but instead focuses on the particular characters as well as various side stories or backstories of the existing characters. Its focus upon backstories and side stories really help explain stuff like villain motives or undersides of characters you didn't really think about or you didn't see before. Contrary to what some community members think about the game, it is quite a good game, even though it is a bit less traditional Falcom in how it plays. Trails in the Sky is like one massive book. The first game is like the prologue section, which enables the player and introduces the player to all the things in the world, which will come to play in the next part. It applies a lot of identity and player connection to each place and character, which makes the plot and the stakes a lot wider in the next game. Second chapter is like the main part of the book, and the conclusion. It really shows the struggles and conclusions of what occurred in the first half of characters' events within the world. Whereas the third is like a separate volume which fills in and investigates these areas of the first and second chapter which didn't get covered. So, stuff like motivations of evil characters or motivation of good characters, or like showing a different side of certain characters you never thought about before. It's definitely worth a look if you want more Falcom, and it's definitely not a waste of time if you decide to play it. As hinted in the previous section, Falcom are extremely talented in their world building ability. Each NPC and character you can find may not have a direct relation to the plot, instead they have some kind of mini arc occurring. This is especially true of side stories, or side quests, which have an impact in the second chapter quite often. Learning of the history of Le Beau was one of my favourite parts of the game, and subsequently, learning about the continental geopolitical affairs involving the Empire of Erebonia, especially with the 100-Day War. However, I believe this continental scale of the world building is best experienced via the different games in the series. By playing each game, you'll slowly cover each part of the world and each different nation of the island. This provides an amazing perspective for the overall story of the game, as you get to see the interests and issues with different groups around the country and around the world. By understanding each game, you understand the issues that each country faces, and this blurs the line between good and bad. Erebonia's portrayal is a particularly important part I'd like to cover within Trails of the Sky because it reflects an authentic case of what countries may do in wartime or times of high tensions. In Trails in the Sky, Erebonia in various texts and the dialogue of citizens around the country, they are viewed as war-hungry or hawks aiming for expansionist goals and probable world domination. This evil image is only developed more as the Empire takes a forward part in the main story, especially when you start to learn more about the events such as the 100-Day War. This is contrasted in the Trails of the Cold Steel, which takes part in Erebonia. You can see none of it's like that, and Libo aren't completely good guys either. Since Erebonia's development is also largely left to Cold Steel, I'm going to leave it there for now. Moving away from larger scale world building events, it's important to know and not forget about the local world development as I've mentioned before. Some games feel like they're missing something when it comes to world development, and for games such as the Tales of Berseria also does world building quite well. A lot of the time the world building feels like it's only relevant to the plot, and it only exists for the point of the plot. The way Trails of the Sky develops its world, it does it for the point of longevity and the point of making the world exist by itself rather than for the immediate payoff with the story. For example, Trails in the Sky loves to mention areas and people that can be seen later on in the game, even if it has nothing to do with the main plot. For example, the Kingfisher Inn, which is mentioned at some point early in the game, you can go to at a later point in the game, and some plot happens there. A few other examples are a countdown to a martial arts event, which happens later on, interview of the state of the Royal Army and the government, which is relevant to the plot somewhat, and a cultural festival later on at school which you can attend. Or even mentioning protagonists or antagonists' exploits within the world, the ripple effect experience in Trails in the Sky from your actions or the actions of other NPCs are very fun to review after a particular big sequence. The small satisfaction you gain from noticing a place name or a person's name or a sightseeing spot or something cultural is really interesting because it means you can make these small connections, and whilst the payoff may not seem massive, it really adds to the authenticity of the world if you can guess or figure out what something is based on what you've read in game. The consistency in developing the world plays only for the interest and benefit of the experience overall, not just for the story. What deserves another minor mention is the Carnelia series, which is a part of a long fiction piece in game you can read via each chapter. What's interesting is that they usually take historically accurate events, or events which are about to happen, and embellish them massively. Ultimately, I'd attribute this minor storytelling and world building to my enjoyment of the Trails series generally. Finally, the last section I want to cover is the gameplay. Like most JRPGs, you can split this easily into the combat or the exploring sections. Combat involves the turn-based battles, with the series' trademark ornaments and arts and crafts. The exploration system serves as the backbone for the story and the world building aspects. Naturally, obviously because this allows you to talk and explore and do everything else the game has to offer. The normal gameplay loop of Trails in the Sky is very much the same, at least for the first and second chapter. The third has a different style of gameplay loop geared much towards combat, which serves as a point of contention within the community as it removes the well-loved freedom of exploration that made FC and SC so strong. The third's purpose within the narrative and its role in developing characters much less requires a particular aspect of gameplay though, but the loss shouldn't be overstated too much for the particular entry. As for the specifics of the gameplay, it's nothing hugely special, but there are some parts of it which make it very interesting compared to other JRPGs. The game's combat is where a lot of the discussion and thought can be placed. However, the unique system in Trails, which continues to come in installments, is the ornament system, which is how you build and create your character effectively. Prefaces: characters come with two options in combat aside from the usual item or flee. This is named the Arts and Craft system. Arts are magic-based abilities which can provide offensive capabilities, pure damage, shielding, healing, most forms of utility, AoE or single target, and must require a certain amount of delay before they can be cast. Healing spells are particularly fast, whereas AoE spells, which do damage, take a lot longer. Arts are not unique to each character, and it strongly depends on the combination of quartz, which are effectively little gems you can put inside your character ornaments to give them abilities, as to what you receive. Quartz have their own effects, such as giving more HP, more defense, faster cast, or more speed, while they also have a thing called a Sepith value. There are multiple colours of Sepith in the game, and the element plus rarity of your quartz will give you a different amount of each one. Your collective Sepith value from all your pieces of quartz will decide what spells you can cast. You can easily see this from the spell list within the game. Conversely, crafts in the Legendary Heroes are the opposite and the more traditional type of JRPG combat option. Crafts use a separate gauge from arts, and they are instacast unlike the waiting a turn to cast spells. Crafts are often better used in defensive situations, as they can put up shields or heal people quickly without having to wait a turn. The entire game of Trails in the Sky combat is resource management, knowing when to attack and when to not attack, as the gauge for your crafts, which are represented by craft points, are only acquired by doing or receiving damage. It is also important to mention that crafts are unique to each character, meaning this will influence why you want to choose each character as well as their base stats. One final thing to mention regarding the combat in Trails of the Sky is the turn order. The turn order appears in most JRPGs, as you can see on the left. However, in this game, various buffs and debuffs or other bonuses exist on this turn order. This means by using the arts to delay your turn, you can potentially get a critical hit or a heal or a mana restore depending on how well you do. This level of planning and delaying ahead of time what you're going to do is really interesting because it allows you to plan these big attacks depending on when critical hits are, or it allows you to recover from situations by planning when to hit a mana restore or a HP restore. Trails in the Sky is one of the 3 starting points I'd personally recommend for the Legend of Heroes series, and whilst it's not the one I'd suggest the most, it's definitely one of them. I'd personally prefer players to start with Cold Steel 1 or Trails from Zero, as they provide a better first game experience. However, starting with Trails in the Sky gives you a better payoff because you see everything from the beginning. The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky is a masterful piece of work by Nihon Falcom, packaged with an interesting combat system and a slow burn story. This quality is a double-edged sword, however, providing long-term fans with an unbeatable JRPG world and experience, but potentially putting up a barrier to new entries. The criticisms regarding the first chapter are relevant here. They pay off later, but such a long game can put off a lot of people. The identity of this game and the passion put into it by the entire series, by the Nihon Falcom team and the development team, is something to be admired and should be experienced by everyone. In either case, the Trails series definitely warrants a play by everyone at some point. Unfortunately, Nihon Falcom's relatively limited advertisement and limited participation in the West make it look like another generic JRPG, meaning it's often missed by Western audiences. The game is cheap on Steam, you can pick it up for less than £10 on sale. Thanks for watching, and as of today, Steam has started a JRPG sale. On the sale you can get all of the Nihon Falcom games for a reduced price. If you're looking for something to pick up, I recommend either Trails of Cold Steel 1 or Trails in the Sky. Trails in the Sky is £6 and it's definitely worth it if you're into retro JRPGs especially. Otherwise Cold Steel might be what you want. Cheers and enjoy if you do play it.